Hey brewers, today I'm going to share the top 10 things I wish I knew when I started brewing. And make sure to hang around for the last one because it is going to blow your mind. Let's kick it off with pitch temps. So, you always want to pitch 2 to 4 degrees below your target fermentation temperature. Now, why is that? It's because when yeast is doing its thing, it's taking up all that sugar, right? It's going to create heat and cause your wort temperature to go up by up to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's significant, and that can put you well outside your target range. By pitching a little lower, you give it a little buffer, so you're accounting for this increase. And typically I see 3 to 5 degrees more realistically to give you a better idea. The only exception with this is Vike, Kvike, Kivik, whatever you might call it. It's the yeast that you ferment real hot, 70 to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And when I use this stuff, I honestly don't pay that much attention to it. I just pitch hot, 75 to 80 degrees, let it ride, let it go. And after the first few days, as with any ale yeast, don't be afraid to let the temperature ramp naturally beyond your target within a few degrees, because this is actually going to help clean up off flavors. It's going to speed up fermentation, and it's going to mature your beer. It should taste better as a result. So next, and this is one of my favorites, okay? So it's actually pretty hard to infect beer. Yes, I said that, and this is going to draw some hate from the internet, I'm sure. But as long as your cleaning and sanitation process is sound and you don't wait a couple days to pitch your yeast, you're rarely going to encounter issues. Freaking out about that statement? Yeah, so let me explain a little more. First, the organism that typically wins out in beer is the one that can multiply the fastest, the one that can increase its population and overtake the solution. So yeast creates alcohol in order to kill off potential competition in the wort, which would be other yeast like wild yeast or bacteria even. And keep in mind, we're pitching a substantial amount of yeast when we actually pitch into our beer. And the purpose behind that is to create a healthy population of yeast and to prevent other organisms from taking over before yeast has a chance to get its foothold. So yeast also lowers the wort's pH, and it scrubs oxygen from solution as a byproduct of fermentation and growth. So you have 3 assurances working for you there. In fact, yeast cares so much about performing its duties and preventing other things from taking hold that it will actually poison itself with its own alcohol production. In over 300 batches of beer, I have had maybe 2 infections. And both were when I cut corners or I forgot to stick to my sanitation process. So do those things and you should be fine. Now, if you're building an IPA recipe, build it backwards. Start with Whirlpool additions and make sure that those Whirlpool additions account for about 90% of your IBUs in the recipe. It's counterintuitive, right? I promise you, you will get bursting hop flavors using this method. In other words, you're going to have a tiny hop addition at about 60 minutes. It's going to feel wrong when you do this, but you're doing it right, I promise. As long as you follow this process. You're going to have a slightly bigger addition at 15 minutes, and then you're going to have a massive addition in your Whirlpool. If you want to take this a step further, skip the 60-minute addition and instead opt for first wort hopping. This is when you add your first hop charge immediately after you take your first runnings from your mash. So just before you start sparging, but after you've mashed. This is going to impart a softer bitterness, so it has less of a bite than you're probably used to. This can have amazing effects for hoppy beers that you don't want to bite too hard. Just make sure, as always, you calculate the IBUs using an app like Brewfather or Brewer's Friend or Beersmith, whatever it is you use. So up next is how to save cleaner. So with a good cleaning process, you can use minuscule amounts of your cleaner. You can make it last a long time. For instance, when I'm cleaning my fermenters using a SIP or a clean in place process, I'm using half to 1 gallon of water and maybe a single scoop of alkaline brewery wash. And this stuff's great. It rinses cold, it cleans cold. I love it. It's a little more expensive than PBW, but I really think it's worth it. If you want to check it out, you can find a link in the description. Most of the time, the recommendations on these cleaners is to dose way too high. So to use way too much cleaner, and I think that's for a couple of reasons. First, they want to make sure that the product works to the statements on the packaging. They want to make sure it works to your expectations, but also they want to make sure that you come back to buy more, as with any consumer product. So next time you're using cleaner, use a little less and see if it still works for you. And you can go from there by titrating it down until you find that it's just not working well enough, and then take it back up a step. That's pretty much it. Now I have really good news for those of you who brew extract and probably people who don't have as much time on their hands that want to get into brewing. So you can make award-winning extract beer. Yes, that's right. So this is great news for everybody who has that limited budget, limited time, or just doesn't want to go all grain. There are some key points that differ from all grain, but most of them are about the same. So here's the thing. You're gonna wanna find fresh ingredients, as always. Fresh hops, fresh yeast, fresh everything when possible. This will always make your beer better. But second, and this is particular to extract brewing, is you wanna add your extract in the last 10 minutes of the boil, and you wanna make sure you take that kettle off of heat, because if you don't, you're gonna scorch it, and it's gonna darken your beer. It may not be what you want, and it's going to add an acrid, roasted flavor potentially, which is definitely not something you're going for if you're making a blonde ale, for instance. Lastly, you're gonna want to start using steeping grains when possible. This helps add some complexity and some color to the beer that you can't get with just using extracts. So beyond all this, you just need to follow the same guidelines you would with any brewing process, all grain, extract, whatever it might be. Consider yeast health and pitch rates, number 1. Number 2 is aerate your wort, make sure it's oxygenated. And then you want to control temperatures adequately during fermentation. And then 4, reduce that oxygen exposure after you pitch. Next is water chemistry. Water chemistry matters, guys. It can seriously change the profile of your beer, and every brewer should learn how to control, at minimum, calcium, chloride, and sulfate. And these are gonna help you achieve a balance that you're looking for. Aim for 25 to 50 parts per million of calcium, and that's going to go into your mash, and it's going to help flocculate the yeast when it's done doing its thing. So you're gonna help clear your beer a little better. It also prevents beer stone, by the way. Aim for a ratio of 1:1 for your sulfate to chloride if you're making a balanced style. If you want more malty, try leaning in one direction. Try 2:1 ratio of chloride to sulfate. If you want more dry and bitter, aim for the opposite, 2:1 sulfate to chloride ratio. Now you don't want to go too high on these. Pro brewers will go up to 400 parts per millionth, but I would suggest staying around 50 parts per millionth if you're doing a balanced profile. 50 parts per millionth calcium, 50 parts per millionth sulfate, and 50 parts per millionth chloride. And generally speaking, I would stay under probably 200 parts per millionth for either of those things. You never want it too far out of balance. Take these tips into account and they will enhance your brewing dramatically. The next one is considering pH and grain to water ratios in your mash. These both contribute to the overall mouthfeel of a finished beer. A lower pH of 5.1 to 5.3-ish translates to a drier beer, and a higher pH of 5.4 to 5.6 is going to translate to a fuller mouthfeel. If you're targeting a drier beer, also use a thin mash. This is really important. I have won tons of awards for making saisons this way. I like my saisons really dry, and one of the ways I accomplish that is with a water to grain ratio of about 1.9 to 2.2 quarts per pound, which is super high. And this really does work, so give it a shot. I know it's a lot of water. On the other hand, keeping the mash thicker is going to help you achieve a fuller mouthfeel for styles that benefit from that, like Bavarian lagers, for instance. Stay close to 1.2 to 1.3 quarts per pound if you want to get that fuller mouthfeel. Next, we have dry hopping. So this is also going to gather some comments, I'm sure, but here we go. I hope you're ready. Don't dry hop for more than 24 hours. You can get away with more time in dry hop by crashing temperatures around to 45 Fahrenheit, but if you're dry hopping at fermentation temps, you might start extracting unwanted grassy flavors after the 24 to 48 hour mark. In my experience, I had a lot of problems with this early on in my brewing days. I found that by reducing the contact time of dry hops in the beer, that I completely negated this issue. Furthermore, it's been shown that you don't need that much contact time for dry hopping. Most of the extraction occurs within 12 hours, actually. The other part of this is that dry hopping can also negatively affect head retention and foam stability as you increase that dry hop contact time. So keeping that to a minimum is not necessarily a bad thing for foam. According to Vinny of Russian River, who I definitely trust for advice around everything brewing, there is a third element at play here, and that is hop creep. To avoid most effects of hop creep, you also want to dump your trub, if possible, at that 24-hour mark. And now you could dry hop again. So if you wanted more dry hop contact time, you would dump your trub at 24 hours, pitch more hops, and repeat. Just keep dumping at 24 hours until you're done dry hopping, and then rack off. I've had crazy success with my IPAs doing this. This is because the majority of the enzymes responsible for triggering hop creep are actually contained in the hop material itself. and not in suspension of the beer. Yes, there are some enzymes in suspension, but most are in that hop material. This is especially true for pelletized hops. Pelletized hops have been run through a hammer mill and all the cell walls have been completely busted open, which means that all those enzymes are just free to enter your beer. Whereas with whole cone hops, you're gonna get much less hop creep because the cell walls have not been degraded. So again, if you pitch a dry hop, wait 24 hours, dump your trub, and repeat as much as you want to, but be sure to consider this final point. Dry hopping increases pH. I don't know why this isn't talked about more, but with each dry hop charge of say 3.9 grams per liter of beer, according to Hopsteiner, you can gain about 0.1 units pH for each 4 grams. This can have significant impacts if you're not building a dry hop plan into your brew from the beginning. You need to consider these things. So to prevent this from happening, you can add a little bit of lactic or citric acid to offset by the amount of pH units you expect to increase from your dry hop charges. So calculate how much you are adding and then estimate, say it could be 0.2 to 0.3 units of pH. Add enough acid to make up the difference. So why does all this matter anyway? One of the ways we can prevent nasty organisms from growing in beer is through a low pH. It's not just from boiling water. There's many aspects of beer that make it antimicrobial. This is just one of them. As pH is creeping up, you could potentially find yourself in a situation where the beer approaches that unsafe zone, that gray area, and could grow unwanted bacteria. A higher pH just opens your beer up to more possibility of eventually growing some sort of pathogen. Now, hops do contain a lot of antimicrobial and antiviral properties, so this may not be a high-risk situation, but it's certainly worth considering. This is especially relevant to commercial breweries who have to stay within compliance, and if their pH rises too high, they could find themselves outside of that compliance, putting their business at risk. So next time you're dry hopping, just make sure to check the pH periodically, add acid as needed. You could even circumvent it by, as I said, just add the acid at the beginning of your dry hop and account for the pH changes that will happen as you dry hop. So there you have it. Those are my top 10 things I wish I knew when I started brewing. Don't forget to subscribe if you got some value out of this, and I have many more of these top things that I keep in my head because I've been brewing a long time, so I plan to share all those in future videos. If you have ideas or things you'd like me to cover in the future, please leave a comment. I love to read them. Thanks for watching, guys, and never stop learning.